When Jesus was on the cross, he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Did Jesus lose his faith on the cross? Short answer, no. In Matthew 27:46, it says, "And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani?" That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, the first time I read this, I thought this was kind of obviously a surprising verse to read, because when you read it, it sounds like Jesus is giving up. He's saying to God, why have you forsaken me, in this moment of desperation when he's on the cross, when he's about to die. And so, my initial thought is, if Jesus is in this really hard moment and even he thinks God's forsaken him, what hope is there for someone like me when I'm in a difficult circumstance? How am I going to keep my faith if even Jesus feels like he's been forsaken, right? Well, the trouble with that reading is it ignores the sort of surprising aspects of the verse, because what I've found in the Bible is when you're reading something and it seems really counterintuitive, really surprising to be there, usually that's a signal that you need to dig a little bit deeper. So here, there's two things that are surprising. The first is what we've already talked about, Jesus supposedly giving up. And the second is the fact that randomly, our New Testament is an English translation of Greek, right? Randomly, in the middle of this Greek passage, Matthew records Jesus speaking in Hebrew, and Mark does the same thing in Aramaic, where he says, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, which, that's not Greek, that's Hebrew. And that little parenthetical that's put right after that, where it says, that is, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's in the original Greek as well, for people who didn't speak Hebrew and didn't understand why Matthew had put in that little Hebrew parenthetical. Well, it turns out there's a reason for that. When I see that Matthew's putting in this little Hebrew bit here, the alarm bells that go off in my head is that Jesus is probably doing something he does quite often, which he's teaching his listeners, in this case any of his disciples who may have been at the foot of the cross, in a somewhat indirect way that requires them to think and requires them to revisit their Old Testament, because that was the scriptures of that time. The New Testament hadn't been written. And so if you look to the Old Testament and look for that phrase, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, you will find Psalm 22. Psalm 22 actually begins with, my God, why have you forsaken me? Verbatim identical to what Jesus said on the cross. Psalm 22 starts out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? So the psalm starts out the exact same way that situation likely looked to Jesus' disciples, is one of lament, one of despair, one of hopelessness. Why is God so far from saving Jesus, his anointed one? Why has he let Pilate and everything going on lead to Jesus being crucified? But if you keep reading the psalm, things actually turn around after a while. First, in verse 14, you start to see these similarities to Jesus' situation, which would be surprising because the psalm was written hundreds of years before Jesus was crucified. In verse 14, it says, I am poured out like water. And then in John 19:34, it says that Jesus was stabbed with a spear and his blood and water poured out strangely. Then in verse 16, it says, they pierced my hands and feet. Again, it doesn't take a lot of insight to realize the similarity to a crucifixion there, which likely crucifixion hadn't even been invented at the time of this psalm's writing, so that's quite surprising. And then in verse 18, it says, they divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garments, which again, in John 19:23, Jesus' clothes are divided. So if you are one of Jesus' disciples and you hear Jesus say, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani in Hebrew, and you know your Old Testament well, you know Psalm 22, you might go home quite distraught, after fleeing the scene, flip over to Psalm 22 and read this and go, wait a minute, this is exactly what just happened. So what happens next? Well, in verse 19, it says, but you, Lord, do not be far from me. You are my strength. Come quickly to help me. And so all of a sudden, there's this turnaround in the psalm. Verse 24 of the psalm says, for he has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. And then if you continue on to verses 27 and 28, it reads, all the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will bow down before him. For dominion belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. Now, this would be quite an encouraging thing to read as a first century Jew who's just witnessed who they thought to be the Messiah being crucified, because not only does it sound like God is going to deliver Israel, but all the ends of the earth are going to be ruled over by the Lord, and he's going to save everyone, right? Not just the people of Israel, but all the nations, the Gentiles around them. And then if you continue to verses 30 and 31, it says, posterity will serve him. Future generations will be told about the Lord. They will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, he has done it. And so this psalm that starts out seemingly from a place of hopelessness with exactly Jesus' words in Hebrew while he was on the cross, then proceeds to prophetically predict many of the things that happened to Jesus on the cross. His blood pouring out like water, them dividing his clothes, them piercing his hands and feet. And then all of a sudden it turns around. And what seemed like a hopeless situation leads to a place of deliverance. And not only deliverance for this anointed one, for Jesus, but deliverance for the entire world. And he has done it.